Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to be doing a tier list ranking all the films in the Halloween franchise. So let's just get right into it. This is going to be done in chronological order, so to begin with we're going to be doing the 1978 original classic, Halloween. So this film obviously belongs in the S tier, so that's where I'm going to put it. It's a classic, right? Absolutely is deserving of the S tier. Great early film from John Carpenter. Him and Debra Hill did a great job with the film, right? It's beautifully shot and scored, and the two of them really did a great job of working within their constraints, right? It feels like such a classy film for being what it is, which is a low-budget slasher film. It obviously owes a great debt to Black Christmas, but it is the film that kickstarted the slasher cycle in North America. So many aspects of the film became archetypes and tropes of the subgenre of slasher films, such as the virginal final girl. Jamie Lee Curtis gives a really good performance, and what horror fan can deny being entertained by Donald Pleasence's Dr. Loomis, who of course became an iconic figure in the franchise. It's such a simple and basic film that's executed at such a near-perfect level by Carpenter, Hill, and the rest of the cast and crew. It is the film that would become the model for other slashers, and really something that they would strive for, but very few would ever even come close to matching. The depiction of The Shape or Michael Myers is of course one of the most iconic horror performances or villain performances in a horror film of all time. And really there's so much I could say to praise this movie. John Carpenter is a genius. I'm a huge fan of almost all of his work, and this is another brilliant film by him. I've watched it every single Halloween. It's one of the perfect Halloween movies to watch. So that's all I can say for this. We'll move on now to the next film. Halloween 2 was released in 1981, written by John Carpenter and Debra Hill, who also produced the film, and was directed by Rick Rosenthal. I'm going to put this movie in the B tier because I believe it's more of a cheap slasher, trying to one-up what came after the first film rather than being a true continuation of the style of the first. While yes, it does incorporate some elements from Carpenter's style, it's done in a much more hacky way. It feels much less classy than the original film was, but it still is a fun movie. It takes a lot of the elements of the slasher film that sort of became a thing after Halloween and sort of takes that into the franchise with some really gruesome kills, some really fun kills, and in general just a fun time, kind of a dumb film with some really brain-dead elements such as the sister element that they brought into the plot. I just thought that was so stupid, so brain-dead, and hurt the franchise. There was elements of the continuation. I liked the fact that it was all on the same night as the first film. So there was some really cool elements of the film. I liked the whole hospital setting as well. So it's a flawed film, but fun film. I definitely think it B tier is where it belongs. It does not match the first film in any serious way, but it's still an enjoyable film, one that I like to watch around Halloween. Next up is Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, which was released in 1982 and written and directed by Tommy Lee Wallace, produced by Debra Hill and John Carpenter. The film also stars Tom Atkins and would not feature Michael Myers for the first time in the franchise after killing him off in the second film. Of course, Debra Hill and John Carpenter were trying to make it into more of an anthology series at this point. It failed miserably, of course, but I still really like this film, and I'm going to put it in the A tier. So yes, like I said, there was no Michael Myers, and this was a novel experiment that obviously was never going to work, but I appreciate that they took the chance. I love it when franchises really do take chances and try and reinvent the formula, rather than just going back to the wheel over and over again and making it a very cynical commercial product like some long-running horror franchises have become, and Halloween even became in its own right. This movie, not only is it just that I appreciate the chances it was taking, right? I also just love the film in general. The story is really fun. The filmmaking is, I think, pretty high level, not obviously matching John Carpenter in 1978 with the original, but nonetheless, it's a really well-made film. So to start with, I love the general conspiracy angle. I love the amorphous sort of witch cult, medieval witch cult that operates this whole town through the business. I love the score. I love the Western-style cinematography. The twists and turns and the great devilish plot that they have to kill all these kids. This is a movie that I think has held up very well. It obviously has a very strong cult following after the initial very strong backlash, and it really feels like a Halloween film, right? It really gets you in the mood for the holiday. I always watch it every Halloween, and it's a movie I really love. It definitely deserves to be in the A tier. So after the major backlash to the third film, the fourth film would of course be subtitled The Return of Michael Myers. They would bring him back. The film would be directed by Dwight H. Little, by a screenplay from Alan B. McElroy. We would not have John Carpenter or Deborah Hill involved in the film. It would be released in 1988. I'm going to put it here into the C tier. That's where I think that it belongs. It's a film that obviously has a very strong Halloween and fall type of feel, especially at the beginning. There's some cool shots there. And it's definitely understandable why they would return Michael Myers to the franchise, reinvigorated on a commercial aspect. But to me, it's nothing more than just a solid slasher film. It feels very generic and repetitive. It's not a film I rewatch often. It feels kind of pointless, right? It did keep the franchise alive, but it's nothing too special. It's competently made, but it's also a film that broke the coherence of the timeline, which is something that, of course, just continues to be messed with now throughout all of the entries, right? But that's about the only interesting thing, really, to say about these movies that come up after Halloween 3, where they're really trying to stick with Michael Myers and the core formula of a slasher film. While, yes, it's enjoyable enough and competently made, why wouldn't I just watch Halloween 1 or even Halloween 2? It just kind of doesn't feel like there's a strong point to continuing to watch this film. And you do break the coherence, which can kind of make for some fun little zigs and zags throughout the franchise history. But in my opinion, this one killed off a lot of the interesting paths the franchise could have done. And so that, for that point, it's kind of a disappointment despite being a decently made film. Next up is Halloween 5, The Revenge of Michael Myers, were released in the next year of 1989. It was directed by Dominique Othenin-Girard, written by him alongside Michael Jacobs and Shim Betterman. It was also produced by Ramsey Thomas. Now, this is a film that, along with the other films in the Curse of Thorn era for the franchise, are really disappointing and really just feel generic and boring and repetitive. A lot of the interesting things about Halloween 5 are in what it could have been, what were some ideas for this whole curse and this whole cult and the Man in Black character and things like that. So yeah, ultimately I really just don't have much to say about this film. I've only watched it once. I just think it's a stupid slasher that's formulaic and unnecessary. It's a cash grab that I found more annoying than scary in any real way. It's a really forgettable film, which is frustrating, right? It does continue these incoherent timelines, and that's kind of a fun aspect, I guess, of this era, but in general, it's just not enough. I want the films that I'm watching to actually be enjoyable and to take chances, not just the behind-the-scenes stuff that could have been, that might have been interesting, or a more interesting perspective that the franchise could have taken or direction it could have taken. That takes us perfectly into the next film, Halloween, The Curse of Michael Myers, released in 1995. The film was written by Daniel Farrands and directed by Joe Chappelle, produced by Paul Freeman. This is yet again another stupid movie. Yes, I do like Paul Rudd as much as the next person, but he can't save this painfully generic slasher film. Another completely unnecessary cash grab, too afraid to take any real chances with content or style, right? Yeah, you have a little bit more of the Cult of Thorn aspect, but ultimately, it is only a little window dressing here and there for what is ultimately a very generic slasher film that I have no real desire to revisit, right? Once again, what's the point of watching 4, 5, or 6? They're nothing different. They're just completely the same stuff going over and over and over again, when I could just be watching Halloween 1 or 2 or some of these other ones that are a little bit more interesting or take more chances. Moving into what became a bit of a reboot for the franchise, the 1998 film Halloween H20 or H2O, 20 years later, directed by Steve Miner based on a screenplay by Robert Zapia and Matt Greenberg. It was produced by Paul Freeman again. The film would star Jamie Lee Curtis and follow the events of the second film. I'm going to be putting the film into the C tier because ultimately it's just a Scream ripoff with a decent cast. It's a very generic 90s teen slasher film at the end of the day, and as much as I love Scream, I want Halloween taking its own unique chances, not just emulating the style of whatever's hot at the moment. Jamie Lee Curtis's return is fun, and she gets a decent character arc with an ultimately cathartic end in which she gets to kill Michael Myers, which is really cool. But ultimately the film just feels gutless. It's not taking chances again. Once again, it's just taking the style of what's popular or what they think is going to sell. And I'm just not in general a fan of this era beyond the Scream films. Other eras had a lot of different unique directors taking unique chances and perspectives. Yes, a lot of times they would be under a kind of similar umbrella, but none of them felt like they were just stealing other people's ideas or styles or themes. This one feels like just a straight up ripoff of Scream, and taking that into the Halloween franchise just feels very cheap and hacky. And while it's a decent cast and everything, I ultimately think the film suffers a lot from feeling like a cheap imitation of a much better horror film. This takes us into Halloween Resurrection, which was released in 2002, directed by Rick Rosenthal, who returns from the second film, from a screenplay by Larry Brandon, Sean Hood, produced once again by Paul Freeman. Putting this film into the F tier, yes, I made an F tier specifically just to put Halloween Resurrection into it, because I think this film is such an embarrassment to the franchise. I hate the film so much. It completely undermines the previous film's ending in one of the stupidest ways I've ever seen, ever in a horror movie, right? The logic is just beyond ridiculous, completely blows past the suspension of disbelief that we have to have as an audience, completely breaks any sort of contract you have with the audience about anything that's happening that's being real. I found it so stupid. I found the way they treated Laurie Strode in the series, the way they killed her off, to be so stupid and pathetic and just a horrible way to treat your main character. It's not funny despite trying to have all this weird humor. It's not scary. It's completely brain dead and stupid. You could say that it takes chances, right? It tries to kind of emulate like, oh, look, Y2K, it's modern and all this stuff. But really, it doesn't do any of that stuff in any way that's interesting. All it does is desecrate what came before it and frustrates anyone with any sense of taste. Horrible acting, directing, kills, everything. One of the worst films I've ever seen from a mainstream horror franchise. It's an absolutely toxic film for the entire series and for the entire name brand of Halloween. I can't believe Rick Rosenthal, who directed a pretty decent second entry, would direct something that's such a piece of shit. I hate this movie so much. Obviously F tier. No debate in my mind at all. This then brings us to the Rob Zombie films, the first one being the remake of the original 1978 film, released in 2007, simply just titled Halloween. It was written and directed by Rob Zombie, produced by Malek Akkad, Andy Gould, and Rob Zombie himself. I'm going to put this one in the C tier. I think it's a solid remake for Zombie. He clearly feels that he still needs to have some Carpenter elements, so it makes this weird sort of fusion between the Carpenter style but also the white trash horror style that Zombie favors. And in general, I'm not in love with the idea of like a background to Myers, but ultimately I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. I'm willing to go and suspend my disbelief because I like the idea of taking a chance with the franchise. And I think ultimately, even though I'm not a huge fan of the idea, I think it was executed okay, but to me it really didn't add anything for later in the film. That being said, though, it's a brutal film with some brutal kills. Myers is scary again, and in general, I think it's an underrated film. One of Zombie's weaker films, when you look at his entire sort of catalog, and especially his early career, I think it's one of his weaker films. It's definitely a step down from something like The Devil's Rejects, but to me it's still a pretty solid film. This then takes us to Rob Zombie's sequel film, Halloween 2, released in 2009, written and directed again by Zombie and produced by the same team. Now, here I am going to be putting it in the B tier, which I know will be controversial amongst a lot of you, but hear me out. So here we have a film that I can't deny but liking, right? It's Zombie Unleashed. He's taking this film and he's dropping all the nods he feels like he needs to make to Carpenter, and instead is exploring a slasher sequel in a unique way, especially for the time. We see it through the lens of the trauma of a survivor of the type of violence of the first film, depicted in a pretty realistic way. It makes our main character, Laurie Strode, a bit less likable, if you will, but in my opinion, it makes her that much more sympathetic in a way, is that she's really becoming kind of an asshole to everyone around her because of the trauma that she's feeling, and it just continues this cycle and cycle of the pushing away the people that you really need to get through what you're going through. So to me, that's just an extra layer of horror, and then you have the return of Myers, and it kind of makes the stupid brother-sister thing a little bit better in the context of this film, even though I still don't really like it. In general, though, I really like what Zombie is doing with this film, and I feel a really strong Lynchian feel to it. It kind of reminds me a lot of Twin Peaks Firewalk with Me, which was a similarly controversial film. Now, that being said, I love both those films, and I don't think it's as good as Twin Peaks Firewalk with Me, but I still think it's executed in a way that's very interesting. The kills are, again, truly brutal, which is something I very much appreciate. I love the hospital sequence in this film. I also love the way Zombie made this film his own, like I was talking about. We have a new take on Loomis, right? That's like a sacred cow for the franchise. He just does away with the original sort of depiction of him and explores his psychology in a more unique way, and in a way that's a little bit more realistic. We have the strange dreamlike white horse imagery that I like. I think it's a strong horror film, right? I think it's a film that maybe won't appeal to a wide audience, but it's one that I really like. That being said, though, I think that I am kind of shocked with how bad of a reputation it has. Now, that being said, I've seen the director's cut of the film only. I haven't really looked at the theatrical release, maybe that kind of explains it. Maybe everyone watched the theatrical release and that's way worse and I'm just not aware. Though usually that doesn't seem to be the case in a lot of movies. But that being said, the things that it gets critiqued for, honestly, I kind of love a lot of those aspects. So ultimately, I can't deny that I like this movie a lot. I think it belongs in the B tier for my rankings. That's something you're probably not going to see in many other people's lists, but it's definitely in mine. That brings us now into the David Gordon Green trilogy with Halloween, the sequel, the legacy sequel that was released in 2018. It was directed by David Gordon Green, written by Jeff Fradley, Danny McBride, and David Gordon Green, produced by Malek Akkad, Jason Blum, and Bill Block. I'm going to put the film into the A tier. I think it was a pretty smart take on how to continue the franchise, like retcon everything after the first film and really just follow the Jamie Lee Curtis character. I think that's a really smart and interesting idea. And in general, I just think this is a very strong legacy sequel. It has this great multi-generational examination of the legacy of the first film, of the multi-generational trauma that's happening as a result of the Michael Myers killings in the first film. And in general, very clever filmmaking from David Gordon Green. We have some really brutal kills, which I always appreciate. That always bumps the movie up in my rankings. I think it's a really fun slasher that I had a very fun theatrical experience with. It also has a great score, of course. John Carpenter was brought back. Great cinematography, good acting, a fun cast, and a fun concept. And look, right? The film obviously is emulating a lot of the things from the first film, sort of similar to how Rob Zombie kind of started his series, right? He's obviously taking it in his own unique take, but he's also, in a lot of ways, putting a lot of strong nods to John Carpenter's film. This one, there's even stronger nods and a stronger sort of legacy and continuation with Jamie Lee Curtis and John Carpenter obviously involved. And look, it does kickstart a trilogy, but in my opinion, it feels like a very solid self-contained film on its own right. This then takes us to the David Gordon Green sequel, Halloween Kills, released in 2021, directed by David Gordon Green, written by Scott Teems, Danny McBride, and David Gordon Green, produced by Malek Akkad, Jason Blum, and Bill Block. I'm putting this film in the C tier because I think the film is a fun, over-the-top, bloody slasher film, which is weird to see this type of film being made in this era, but I admire it. It has some really and truly brutal kills that I love. I love a lot of the violence in the movie, the effects that they use are really cool. Now, on the downside, why I think this film isn't at the peak that it could have been for the whole series, why it's only in the C tier, is that unfortunately, the attempted social commentary that David Gordon Green tries to put in the film just falls flat on his face. I also think Jamie Lee Curtis feels just completely non-present, taking away one of the strongest aspects of the first film, and there's just too much weak connective tissue to make this more than just a fun, bloody romp. Like I said, I really enjoy it. It reminds me a lot of Halloween 2, like the original Halloween 2, and the way that kind of was a continuation of the first film. This one feels very much in line with the style of Halloween 2 from Rick Rosenthal. So it's a fun film. I put it in the C tier. There's some weaknesses that ultimately drop it. That now takes us to the final film to date of the Halloween franchise, the finale to David Gordon Green's trilogy, Halloween Ends, released in 2022, directed by David Gordon Green, written by Paul Brad Logan, Chris Bernier, Danny McBride, and David Gordon Green, produced by Malek Akkad, Jason Blum, and Bill Block. I'm going to put this film into the B tier. Now look, at first, I did not like this film when I saw it in the theaters. I actually hated it. I thought this was a stupid way to end the trilogy and just a dumb film for the franchise. But ultimately, it slowly grew on me and I became an appreciator of what David Gordon Green was going for. What a madman to be inspired by Wong Kar-wai to make a romance film as the capper to your horror trilogy, which is supposed to have this, penultimate showdown between Laurie Strode and Michael Myers. Now, we ultimately do get that showdown at about the last 10 to 15 minutes, but we mostly follow a character that we haven't been following the entire trilogy. We didn't even know about him, but he is the vehicle through which David Gordon Green does a much better job of incorporating the serious themes and social commentary that he was striving for in Kills, and it kind of matches along with the way that they're continuing the franchise, and they're ending Michael Myers' physical existence, but they're showing the way that his metaphysical presence is continued through the way that the town crafts a new evil and projects it onto a kid. I love that. And look, it might not have been the film we expected, but I think it's technically well done. It's got an interesting story, an interesting take on the material. A romance film in Halloween, like what? So not expected, so fresh and new. Good acting, some cool kills still, right? Some brutal stuff. A lot of cool inspirations going on from like Christine and all these things. Which makes this an interesting trilogy capper for David Gordon Green and an interesting way for us to finish off the franchise for now. Of course, there's going to be more Halloween movies, but I like David Gordon Green's trilogy despite a lot of the inconsistencies that are sometimes there in quality. Halloween Ends is not a perfect film by any means, that's why it's in the B tier, but I like it nonetheless. Now that being said, that's it for my tier list. Of course, there's some films that I am widely divergent with the mainstream public opinion, so I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. And thank you guys all for watching. Happy Halloween.